Have you ever pushed yourself in a workout, feeling that burn, and then wondered, was that enough? Too much? Or uh, was it just right? Finding that balance, that quest for the sweet spot in training. No, it isn't just for us weekend warriors.
No, absolutely not. It's really the ultimate challenge for elite athletes, isn't it? Striving for peak performance, but without tipping over into injury.
Exactly. And it's precisely this complex dance, this relationship between pushing limits and recovering smart, that fascinates coaches and athletes.
Which is why today, our deep dive is all about understanding how an athlete's feeling during training connects, or maybe doesn't connect, with their body's actual biological response deep down.
Yeah, we're going to unpack some really cutting-edge science that could, genuinely change how we think about optimizing performance and maybe preventing overtraining.
And our guide for this exploration, our source material, is a really insightful study. It's titled Weekly Fluctuations in Subjective and Objective Measures of Internal Training Load and Their Relationships in Male Elite Rowers.
Quite a title. Who's behind this research?
It's authored by Xinyu Dai, Jihong, and Xuecui. And it was published pretty recently in 2025 in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine.
Okay, got it. So our mission today is really to distill the most impactful knowledge from this paper, basically give you a shortcut to being well-informed about this, well, pretty nuanced world of high-performance athletic training.
That's the plan.
All right, so we often talk about training load. There's the external stuff, like how far you rode, how much weight you lifted.
Right, the easily measurable things, distance, power output, time.
But then there's the internal load, how your body actually reacts and adapts. And pinning that down, that seems to be the real challenge, doesn't it?
Absolutely. External load is the what of the training session. But it's the internal load, the physiological stress, the cascade of responses inside the athlete that dictates adaptation. That's what determines progress or fatigue or even injury.
And the tricky part is, everyone responds differently, right?
Precisely. Each athlete processes that external work uniquely. What crushes one person might be a warm-up for another, physiologically speaking.
So traditionally for internal load, we've looked at things like heart rate, maybe blood lactate.
Yes. Objective markers.
Yes, those are the classic objective measures.
But this study, it really highlights the power of something different. Subjective methods. Particularly one called the Session Rating of Perceived Exertion, or SRPE. How does that give us a different perspective?
Well, what's really fascinating and increasingly validated in sports science is the power of simply asking the athlete.
Yeah.
The SRPE scale is, it's remarkably simple on the surface.
How simple.
Athletes just rate their overall exertion for the entire session, usually on a scale like 1 to 10 shortly after they finish training. But from that single number, researchers can derive these other really crucial metrics.
Like what?
Things like the acute-chronic workload ratio, the ACWR, which compares recent load to baseline load, and also training monotony and training strain, which look at the variation in overall stress.
And why are these subjective derived metrics so powerful? Because they're non-invasive, first off. No needles, no monitors needed during the session itself. They're incredibly convenient, often just a quick entry in an app. And they offer almost immediate insight into how the athlete is actually coping with the load. It captures their personal lived experience.
Okay, so that's the subjective side, the athlete's perception. But the researchers didn't stop there. They also dove into the objective side, the hard physiological data. What biomarkers were they looking at?
Right, they wanted both sides of the coin. So on the objective side, they focused on blood-based biomarkers. Think of these as the body's own internal gauges, signaling stress and recovery.
Such as?
They looked at things like blood urea, often called BU, and creatine kinase, CK. BU relates to protein breakdown. CK is often linked to muscle damage or stress. They also tracked white and red blood cells and key hormones like testosterone and cortisol.
Hormones, too. Interesting. So standard stuff in elite monitoring.
Yeah, these are pretty routinely monitored in high-level sports to gauge the acute internal load, assess muscle stress, inflammation, hormonal balance, that sort of thing.
So we have these two approaches, subjective feeling, objective markers. Why was this specific study on rowers needed right now? What gap was it filling?
That's a key point. Despite growing interest in both subjective and objective monitoring, there was a real lack of studies that tracked both simultaneously in the same group of elite athletes over a significant period, especially in rowers.
Ah, so longitudinal data was missing.
Exactly. And crucially, there wasn't a clear understanding of how these two different types of data, the feeling and the blood work, actually relate to each other week by week. Do they tell the same story? Do they diverge? This study aimed to provide that empirical evidence for elite male rowers.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So how do they set it up? How did they structure this investigation to bridge that gap?
It was an observational and longitudinal study design. They followed 26 professional male rowers for 6 consecutive weeks. This was from early November to early December back in 2024.
And these weren't just any rowers.
No, definitely elite. They were from the Shaanxi Water Sports Management Center in China. The average age was around 21, almost 22 years old. Physically, quite imposing, average height, nearly 6'4", average weight about 202 pounds. A very specific, high-level group.
And their training during these 6 weeks, what did that look like?
Oh, it was rigorous. The paper details it. Average weekly load was over 315 minutes of resistance training, a massive 817 minutes of on-water training, 340 minutes on the rowing ergometer, plus about 60 minutes of functional training.
Wow, that's a lot of work.
It certainly is. It was structured as a specific mesocycle, an initial conditioning phase, then 4 weeks of really intensive training, capped off with a final active recovery week.
Okay, so against that backdrop of intense structured training, how did they collect all this data, the subjective and objective stuff, so precisely?
They were meticulous. For the subjective data, the SRPE, athletes used a validated mobile app. Crucially, they had to record their rating within 30 minutes after each session finished.
Why so quickly?
To ensure accuracy. Memory fades, perceptions can shift. Getting it right way is key. From those daily ratings, they then calculated the weekly totals. SRPTL, which is session RPE multiplied by duration, and also the ACWR, training monotony, and training strain.
Okay, that covers the subjective part. What about the blood markers?
For the objective measures, they collected venous blood samples. This was done on scheduled rest days early in the morning, and after the athletes had fasted overnight. They even monitored diet to minimize external influences.
Sounds very controlled.
Extremely. A specialized team handled the whole process: collection, transport, analysis of the biomarkers. It really highlights the scientific rigor involved.
Right, the level of detail needed for this kind of research.
Yeah.
Okay, so they've got all this data over 6 weeks. Let's get to the findings. What did the week-to-week fluctuations actually reveal?
This is where it gets really interesting. The subjective load, the SRPTL, it showed a pretty clear pattern. It increased steadily from week 1 and peaked in week 5, the last big training week.
And week 6 was recovery.
Yes, and as you'd expect, the SRPTL showed a substantial decrease in week 6. But, intriguingly, week 2 actually had the highest training monotony.
Training monotony,
Meaning the training load was very consistent day to day during that week, less variation. This can sometimes suggest a period where fatigue might start accumulating, even if the absolute load isn't the absolute peak yet. It often comes with an acute jump in intensity, too.
Okay, that's a subtle but important point. Now, what about the ACWR, that acute chronic workload ratio you mentioned, often seen as a flag for injury risk?
Yeah, the ACWR data was also quite revealing. In weeks 2 and 3, the values started creeping up, approaching that zone, often considered a bit risky, heading towards 1.5. Values between 1.0 and maybe 1.49 are often seen as the sweet spot for adaptation, but getting near 1.5 raises concern.
So a potential warning sign early on.
Potentially, yes. It indicated the load was ramping up significantly compared to their chronic baseline. But then by week 6, the recovery week, the ACWR dropped nicely, well away from that higher risk zone. It showed the planned deloading was working, at least from an ACWR perspective.
Got it. Now, shifting to the objective side, the blood tests. Were there any surprises there, any unexpected physiological patterns?
There definitely were some interesting hormonal findings. Cortisol, the classic stress hormone, didn't peak during the hardest training weeks. It actually progressively increased from week 1 and hit its highest point during week 6, the recovery week.
Really? Cortisol peaked during recovery? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? It might reflect lingering cumulative stress or perhaps the physiological shift during recovery itself. Testosterone, on the other hand, showed what they called a biphasic pattern.
Biphasic.
Meaning it went through 2 phases. It initially increased in the early weeks, but then declined over the later part of the study period.
Okay, so complex hormonal shifts. But did these hormones track with how the athletes felt? Did they correlate with the subjective load, the SRPE?
And this is perhaps one of the most fascinating findings. While testosterone and cortisol themselves showed a pretty consistent negative correlation with each other as one went up, the other tended to go down quite strongly, actually, with an R value around never 0.64.
Okay, so they moved in opposite directions, which makes sense hormonally.
Right. But the study found no significant relationship between either of these key hormones and the subjective training load measures like SRPTL.
Wow. So how stressed the athletes felt didn't seem to directly map onto their testosterone or cortisol levels. Why might that be?
The researchers suggest it could be down to high individual variability.
Hmm?
How each athlete's endocrine system, their hormone system, responds to training stress can differ quite a lot. So at a group level, that connection to perception wasn't clear for these specific hormones.
Okay, so hormones operated a bit independently of perception. But surely something objective lined up with how hard the rowers felt they were working. Where did the subjective and objective measures really connect?
Yes, this is the real aha moment, I think. The study found significant positive correlations between all the subjective load variables, SRPD health, training monotony, training strain, and ACWR, and two key biochemical markers, blood urea, BU, and creatine kinase.
CK. Okay, BU and CK, remind us what they indicate again.
BU, blood urea, is generally seen as a marker reflecting protein breakdown, like from muscle tissue turnover, dietary protein metabolism. CK, creatine kinase, is an enzyme that leaks out of muscle cells when they're damaged or stressed, so it's a pretty common indicator of muscle stress and managing cellular energy.
And the correlations were strong.
They were statistically significant and quite robust. For BU, the positive correlations with the subjective indicators range from R0.40 up to RU0.44. For CK, the links were even stronger, with correlations ranging between RU0.50 and RU0.66.
So RE0.60, that's a pretty decent correlation in this kind of research.
It really is. It means there's a substantial association.
What does that powerful connection tell us, practically speaking? What's happening inside the body when those subjective and objective markers align like that?
It's incredibly validating for the subjective approach. It means that when these elite rowers perceived their exertion to be higher, or when their calculated subjective workload, like ACWR or strain, was higher, their bodies were indeed showing corresponding increases in markers associated with protein breakdown and muscle stress.
So the feeling wasn't just a feeling, it mirrored real physiological events.
Exactly. The synchronous rise in BU and CK alongside the warrantly subjective loads strongly suggests that the SRPE method and the metrics derived from it truly reflect changes in the rower's functional status and the degree of muscle stress they're under. What they feel is biochemically substantiated, at least regarding these markers.
That's a really key finding. Now, you also mentioned something intriguing about the recovery week earlier.
Yeah.
Week 6. Even when the coaches deliberately reduced the external load, the rower's subjective SRPE stayed somewhat elevated.
Yes, that was another crucial observation. Despite the planned reduction in training volume and intensity during week 6, the athlete's perception of effort, their SRPE ratings, didn't drop as much as you might expect based solely on the external load change. They remained somewhat elevated.
What's the implication there? Why does that matter?
It's hugely important. It strongly suggests that the rowers were carrying accumulated fatigue from the preceding intensive weeks. This lingering fatigue influenced their perception of effort, even when the actual work was less.
So the body remembers, even if the plan changes.
Precisely. And it highlights a potential pitfall. If coaches rely only on objective load prescription, like just cutting volume, they might miss detecting this underlying progressive fatigue that the athlete is still experiencing and reporting.
It really underscores the value of listening to the athlete, doesn't it? Their perception holds vital information.
It absolutely does. Their subjective experience might be a more sensitive indicator of cumulative fatigue than just looking at the planned external load for that specific week.
Okay, so bringing all these fascinating threads together. What are the big, practical, real-world takeaways for coaches, for athletes, maybe even for those of us who train seriously but aren't elite rowers?
Well, first and foremost, given these strong correlations, especially with BU and CK, coaches can feel much more confident using SRPE and its derives metrics, ACWR, strain, monotony, as a core part of their daily monitoring.
Why daily?
Because it's timely, it's incredibly cost-effective compared to frequent blood tests, and it's non-invasive. It gives you immediate feedback every single day. It's also potentially more reliable than, say, heart rate metrics, which can be influenced by many factors, or wearable tech, which can sometimes have data errors.
So it's practical and validated by this research.
Highly practical for day-to-day load management in an elite or even sub-elite setting.
And thinking specifically about injury prevention, which is always a huge concern, did the study offer concrete insights there?
Yes, I think the link between ACWR and CK levels is particularly actionable. The findings suggest that the reason ACWR might predict injury risk is potentially because higher or rapidly increasing ACWR values are associated with greater muscle damage, as indicated by higher CK.
Ah, so ACWR isn't just an abstract number. It might reflect actual tissue stress.
Exactly. It suggests athletes with higher ACWR might have increased muscle damage and therefore a reduced tolerance to subsequent training loads. This gives coaches a physiological rationale for using ACWR to make smarter, proactive adjustments to training, aiming to keep CK levels and thus injury risk in check.
It empowers them to potentially head off injuries before they happen.
That's the goal, making data-informed decisions to manage load effectively, potentially extending careers and maximizing performance windows.
It really sounds like the big message here is about integration, isn't it? Not just relying on one type of data.
Absolutely. This study provides really strong empirical backing for an integrated approach. Combining the athlete's subjective feedback, what they feel, captured via SRPE, with periodic objective checks, like hematological assessments for markers like CK and BU.
Getting the full picture.
Precisely. By looking at both what the athlete reports and what their physiology shows, coaches can fine-tune training schedules much more effectively. They can promote positive adaptations while hopefully minimizing the risks of overtraining, burnout, and injury. It's about getting that holistic, nuanced view of the athlete's state.
Now, of course, we need to be critical consumers of research. No single study tells the whole story. What were some of the limitations or caveats we should keep in mind with this particular paper?
That's always important. The authors themselves note a few limitations. Firstly, the sample size of 26 rowers, while decent for elite athlete research, wasn't formally calculated based on statistical power beforehand.
Okay, what else?
Secondly, the analysis was done at the team level. It didn't really drill down into potential differences based on individual athlete roles within the rowing team, which can sometimes involve different training demands.
Right, not all rowers might experience the exact same load.
Potentially. And thirdly, and this is quite significant, the study focused exclusively on male professional rowers.
So we need to be cautious about generalizing.
Exactly. While the findings are incredibly valuable for understanding this specific population, we can't automatically assume they'll apply directly to female athletes or athletes at different competitive levels or even in different sports without more research confirming similar patterns.
Good points. It's powerful data, but within its specific context.
Precisely.
This has been incredibly insightful. It really bridges that gap between feeling and physiology. It leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. What might your own subjective feelings be telling you about your physical state, whether you're training for a marathon or just managing daily stress? And how could combining that self-awareness with maybe some readily available objective information, even simple things like resting heart rate or sleep tracking, unlock new levels of insight into your own well-being and performance? It's definitely something worth pondering.
It really is. And for those listening who want to dive even deeper into the specifics, the methodology, the full statistical analysis, we strongly encourage you to read the original article. Again, it's Weekly Fluctuations in Subjective and Objective Measures of Internal Training Load and Their Relationships in Male Elite Rowers by Xinyu, Jihong, and Xuecui.
And it's in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine. You can usually find articles like this using the DOI, the Digital Object Identifier. We'll put that in the description. It's https://doi.org 10.52082 JSSM.2025.269.
Definitely worth a read if you're serious about training science.
Absolutely. And of course, to make sure you don't miss out on more deep dives like this one, exploring cutting-edge research across various fields, remember to follow our channel and turn on those notifications.